sometimes feel frustrated when you talk to your family and friends? Do you ever have difficulty sharing your ideas with your boss or your employees? Do your conversations ever turn into fights or arguments? Well, if you've ever faced any of these situations, you're certainly not alone. Hi, I'm Donna Hibbits, and welcome to this program, which is brought to you by the Counseling Without Walls Foundation. Today we're going to focus on how you can be a more effective communicator. For talking, listening, it isn't always so simple. And with us to share his expertise is my guest, Mr. Joe Edelman.
Hi.
Mr. Edelman is an attorney in Santa Monica. He's also a mediator. He is trained in marriage and family counseling, and he specializes in the resolution of disputes through mediation. Mr. Edelman currently serves as adjunct professor of law in mediation at Loyola and USC Law Schools. He's founder of the Santa Monica Neighborhood Justice Center, and he's a family law mediator for the Superior Court of the State of California. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Yes. It's quite an impressive list of credentials.
Well, I've been busy.
I stated briefly that you are a mediator.
Uh-huh.
What exactly does that involve?
Well, that's really a relatively new kind of work in our world, and I think it's a very important one. 6 years ago, when I was the founding director of the Neighborhood Justice Center, we started doing mediation in the community, and I now do it privately. And basically what mediation is, it's a way for people who are having disputes with each other, such as business partners or merchants and customers or families, particularly with divorcing couples who don't want to go out and hurt each other in the process, but they want to get what they want out of it. Well, I sit down with both of them in a confidential setting and help them resolve, work out the dispute so that they both get what they want. It's a win-win situation. It's not one person winning and the other person losing. I don't represent either one of them as such, but I just help them work out the problem and help them come up with a written agreement so they can get on with their lives.
It's very challenging.
It certainly is.
So communication is really at the core of what you do.
Yeah, communication is at the heart of things. It is what allows this process to happen. Both my communication with them and them being able to communicate with each other. Perhaps for the first time I've dealt with couples who've been divorced, who have been married for 25 years and who really have had relatively little direct communication with each other. And sometimes over the process of weeks or months in getting them to say what they're needing at this point in order to get on with their lives, it's some of the clearest communications that's happened, and they'll tell each other things that they never heard before. It's really amazing.
Must be very fascinating and fun.
It is.
When we talk about communicating, I talk, you listen, you talk, I listen. It seems so simple, but what does it really mean to communicate with someone?
What it really means to communicate is to have a successful message get across, and there are really a number of components of that. First of all, there is the sender, the person who is wanting to communicate something to the other person, the receiver, and then there's a step that many people disregard. It's getting the feedback, finding out whether there's been a successful communication or not. That's really at the heart, the desire to want to communicate, to want to be clear and want to be direct is probably the most important part of successful communications.
Okay, so let's break this down. The sender. I want to tell you something. What do I have to do to get my point across to you?
Well, the first thing you need to be is as clear as you can possibly be as to what message you're trying to convey. Many people in the world think they're communicating and they're really not, because they're not clear of themselves as to what they want to say. They just want, sometimes some people just want to talk, just want to have attention paid to them, or they want to display some emotion. They're not really wanting to convey any information. They're maybe wanting to convey a feeling state.
Okay, so the first thing one has to do is be direct.
Well, first thing you need to be is to be clear in your own mind as the communicator as to what you're wanting to convey.
Okay, but I know there are times with me that I know I want to tell someone something, but I'm too scared of telling them exactly how I feel about a situation. I'm scared of being vulnerable or being honest. What do I do?
Well, you are not alone. Most people in the world are, we've been conditioned to kind of be fearful and to not be communicating in as direct and honest a way as possible. And there's some very simple devices that you can use to get over that initial gap. One of the things you can say is, geez, I'm real nervous about this, or I don't know what to say, I don't know how to communicate this, and I may not be successful at it, but here goes. Something to make somebody comfortable. In fact, part of an important part of a successful communication is not just the message itself, but the surrounding circumstances, the attitude, the climate that you set, the tone that's set. Because if you set a tone where somebody's going to be receptive to whatever the message is, then they're going to receive it. And so they're not going to be defensive or in some other way not be able to receive it. So setting the tone of the communication is at least as important, if not more so, than the words you're trying to get across.
Can you give me an example of that? What kind of attitude I should set with a person?
Well, let me give an example from the kind of practice that I have in doing mediation. I try to pay attention to everything that happens and that is set up. My office is set up in colors and in tones that suggest, calmness and peace, because one of the things I'm trying to convey to people is that this is a place to communicate from one to the other. It's a homey place. There are plants there and comfortable furniture, and we sit around. That is to set the tone, to have the setting. And in words, that kind of thing can be done maybe by having a little light conversation first, not on the message, or the way, for example, that is very common in the Orient. Even for business people, they won't talk about business. You go and deal with a Japanese company, you may spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, or a whole day just sitting around and being entertained, having a drink, some dinner, conversation, just making
breaking the barriers down.
Breaking the barriers, making people at ease.
Yeah,
you want to get people at ease. Yeah.
Okay, so we have to be direct, and we have to set the right kind of atmosphere, climate. What else?
Okay, one of the things you want to do is to know what it is, not just what you're wanting to communicate, but if you're wanting something from the other person, to be clear in your own mind what it is you're wanting.
Okay. If I'm an employee and I want a raise, I go in and say, I want a raise. Very simple in that situation.
Right.
A lot of times, though, we don't know what we want.
Right. And sometimes it's useful if you don't know what you want, but you just know that you want to communicate, is to put that out just as is. Listen, I'm not sure exactly what I'm wanting from you, but I do know that I'm wanting to be talking to you.
Yeah. Which is important itself.
Yeah, which is important. And that's a helpful message, not only in setting the right atmosphere, that's a helpful message in communicating what's going on with you.
Okay. What are some things that one should avoid when they're sending a message?
Avoid unclarity. That is, it's almost always best to speak in short sentences, to not have compound matters in the same sentence or paragraph or whatever else. Be as direct as you can, and it's hard because so many of us have learned that you should get around people somehow, or use psychology on them, or in other words, be manipulative. And almost always in the long run, those things come back to bite you in the behind. That it's almost always better to put out directly what you want.
And how important is it to think about the other person, to really consider what they're going through? Is that important? Well,
it's not only important, it's really the other aspect to it, because you cannot have a successful communication unless the other person receives it. So the more you know about the language, and I'm not talking about Spanish, English, and French, but the terms, so as you're not going to use any jargon that may have meaning to you but not to the other person. You want to speak in a language they can understand, at a distance they can understand. I mean, there are some cultures in which people are best communicating when they're really close to each other, maybe 18 inches, in some other cultures it's a distance. So you want to know enough about that person to know what's going to make them the most comfortable in terms of how far to stand, in terms of what language to use, in terms of how to start out, and where you want to go.
Okay. Say, for example, we have a husband and wife situation, and the husband is upset because the house is not clean. How do me as a husband, how do I approach that? I know I shouldn't really direct attack her, but maybe talk about the problem instead. Is that how?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that in a husband-wife situation, this will not be the first time this issue has come up.
Right.
Okay, so we're assuming there's a lot of history to it, and probably a lot of history that may not be too pleasant. It may have come up before, so that needs to be taken into account. To choose a time to say it when the wife is the most receptive to a message. Certainly not when you walk in, or maybe when she happens to be cleaning or doing something else, but maybe after dinner when they're relaxing. And then perhaps to say something like, to remind the wife about whatever conversation that they may have had before about it. You know, we've talked about this before, and I just want to emphasize again, it's really important to me that the house be reasonably clean, and I would like to, I mean, it's a problem for me when it's not. And to just start out, not to try to convey too much at once,
Right.
but just to set the tone and the terms of the fact that it's a problem without giving any orders, without telling her what to do or what not to do, but just getting the idea that it's a problem for me, the husband.
I like that you said you had a problem. You weren't attacking her,
Right.
but you said, I have a problem with the house.
That's
not being
another
clean.
important aspect of communication, to own the problem yourself. If you're having a problem with it, it may not be a problem with the other person. To her, the house may be perfectly clean and fine and
Right.
acceptable. It's your problem.
That way
Okay.
you can work on it together.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Then we have this whole subject of nonverbal communication. Researchers have found that we obtain 35% of our meaning from verbal messages, but 65% of the meaning from nonverbal messages.
Yeah.
It's very important, isn't it?
Yeah. Sometimes I think it's even more extreme than that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of things that we communicate just by not. I mean, things like body language. I mean, somebody sits there like this. They're communicating something. I mean, it's that they may be angry or defensive, or maybe if they're sitting over like this, they might be afraid, or if they're really frowning, or if their eyes are really wide open like this, then they may be amazed and frightened. I mean, those are some of the obvious things. But there are lots of subtle ways that people communicate. I mean, if I were to sit like this with you, and we're supposed to be having a conversation, that's a message to you right away. That's like, that's a kind of an angry message, ignoring the other person. And so you want to pay attention. I mean, if you want to be a good communicator, it's important to be a real self-observer, to be aware of what you're doing, how you're talking, how you're sitting, standing. It's like learning to play golf. The first time you're through it, you have all these instructions on what to do. Try to remember to do everything, and you can't do it.
So you're looking at yourself.
Looking at yourself. Not in a way to make a judgment, to slap yourself, oh, that was wrong, that's terrible, but in a way to pay attention, to be aware of what you are doing. And the people who are the best communicators, and the people who are basically the most contented in the world, are those who have the greatest amount of self-observation and awareness of not just what they're communicating, what they're feeling.
It's difficult to do many times, so look at yourself.
Oh yeah, it's so
in an
hard.
objective way, like that. Okay, we've talked about sending the message, verbally and non-verbally. How about listening? How important is it to listen to a person?
Well, of course, the only way to really be able to communicate to somebody is first to be a good listener. Good listener, and listener not just in a verbal sense of listening, but listening in the sense of seeing and paying attention to what's important to the other person and paying attention to what's going on in their world. Because if you know what they're all about and what's important to them, then you can, and are listening to them in that most general sense, then you can talk in their language, you can convey to them a message that's going to be meaningful to them in a way that's meaningful to them. So you have to be a good listener. In fact, a good part of what we do, for example, in mediation is have people listen to each other. There's a phrase that's used like active listening, where you're asking the person for some feedback directly on what they heard. Ask them to repeat the message you're giving out. And sometimes what's a good thing to do is to find out what has been successfully communicated by asking that person.
Okay. So you have to pay attention and give feedback. What else do we have to remember as listeners?
That you really have to want to be heard. Some people will talk just to get something off their chest, and it doesn't make any difference to them whether they are listened to or not. And that's not going to make for real successful communication. it's paying attention to how the communication will be received and watching the other person as you're talking. Because people will give automatic clues. They may look the other way when you say a certain thing. Well, you may want to ask them what happened at that point to see whether you had a successful message. So really being a keen observer.
You know, I am so flattered when people say they're ready to listen to me. And it's so important. But I'm not a very good listener. Are most people good listeners?
Very few people have been trained to be good listeners.
Why don't we listen?
Basically because we're too busy emoting, too busy getting out, wanting to get our way, wanting to get information to other people. And even though you say, well, the average person spends 6 hours a day watching TV or listening to TV, but that's something else. I mean, that's almost like, you know, being in front of, being real passive. You know, it's not like having a conversation. But listening is really important for a conversation. And do you ever recall, for example, ever having a class in any school in listening, in grade schools?
No.
But maybe the single most important thing that you can learn to do, there's virtually no attention paid to it. The assumption in most authoritarian schools is that you're here to learn what they tell you, you know, of what's important and what ought to be communicated, but nobody pays really attention to how much you're taking it, how much you're listening, except maybe on exams or whether you can repeat the words back to somebody. But that's not real listening.
I know when I'm talking to you now, you're talking, but when you'll say something, it'll trigger my mind, and I'll think, well, I'll start to think about something else, and I won't even listen to what you're saying.
That's hard. It's hard to concentrate. The whole notion of focusing in and directing your energy just and focusing on the other person is so hard. Most of us are so dispersed and diverted that it's real difficult just to pay attention and repeat it. Remember the kids' game of telephone? I remember in the 3rd grade, teacher told the first child in the class a story, and then it went around the room and it came back, and you know, it was a totally different story. Well, that's the kind of thing that happens all the time. People really aren't listening very carefully.
Okay, how can I be a better listener? Just to concentrate on what you're saying and really paying attention, or is there more to it than that?
The first thing you need to do is to want to do it, to want to focus, to want to really to be open to learning what the other person has to say and what they're trying to communicate, and wanting to give them some feedback. Well, did I understand this correctly? That is, being a good listener is being a good communicator too, because if you're really wanting to pay attention to somebody, you've got to check out that what you heard is what they're intending to say. Not necessarily always in words, but in some other way.
Okay, so to be a good listener, you have to give feedback. And that's basically validating what that person's saying?
Validating in the sense of making sure that you've got an accurate message. Not necessarily agreeing, because you can be a good receiver and acknowledge the message without agreeing with it. You may not like the message, you may disagree with it, but before you disagree with it, it's much better to make sure you got an accurate message.
So, as a listener, I would tell the person what they told me. I would repeat that. I know it's very frustrating when you're trying to tell someone something and they come back with something you hadn't even said. Okay, so we have to repeat what they say, and what else do we have to do?
Well, this is not a matter of have to. These are things which are little techniques, little helpful things under the general heading of really wanting to listen and wanting to communicate. What other things to do is to want to convey to them something back, to want to acknowledge that they're an okay person. Because much of what people are really seeking when they're communicating is an acknowledgement that they're okay, that they're not crazy, that they're not wrong, that they have a legitimate point of view. So having that in the back of your mind, that when people are communicating, that's often what they want, is a good thing to keep in mind. It's not a technique in and of itself, it's a kind of a consciousness.
Okay. Yeah, just to be listened to. And you're not judging the person. That you're just listening
Right,
to them,
not
letting them
judging
blow
them.
off steam if they want,
Mhm.
and working it out in some way.
Right, and that's so hard because all of us have our buttons which get pushed like that.
Yeah.
You know, and something says we are all trained to have opinions about things, to look at a situation and immediately make a judgment about who's right, who's wrong, what ought to be done. If you can hold back your own need to react to a situation, it's your own internal knee-jerk reaction, you're going to be a lot better communicator and a better listener.
Okay. Okay, we've got the process down, the sender, the listener, and the feedback. Let's go to a few examples of problems we have in communication. What are some big problems that people have?
Well, the biggest problem that people have is when they get into conflicts, differences of
definitely.
opinions or different situations. And one way to classify the different ways that people deal with conflicts, and I've got about 5 different ways.
Oh, good. Okay.
One of them is those people who are blamers, that whenever there is a difficulty, a problem, a dispute, it's your fault. You did it.
Yeah.
You, when you took out the garbage, you're the one who spilled it all over the place, and I had no responsibility for whatsoever. And the other person may come back and said, well, you're the one who put the bag in there with a hole in it. You know, and so they're both so into blaming the other person that they're not willing to take any responsibility for it. That's a real a way that many people deal with. I mean, even for example, in international relations, you know, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, almost all the things we're saying, we're blaming them. They're doing something wrong, and they're just kind of blaming us all the time. It's our fault.
Okay.
So it goes from the most domestic situation to the most global situation.
How do you deal with someone who always blames you for this problem? What do you say to them?
Well, say, one thing you can do that is often very disarming is to say, yeah, you're right. I could have done this differently. And one of the things that happens, especially when dealing with a blamer, is when you are able to take responsibility for it. If your ego is not so big that you've got to totally be defensive, and you can say, yeah, this is partly my fault. A lot of that need on the other person's part to do the total blaming dissolves somewhat, and then they're ready to be able to take some responsibility for it.
I can see
and
that.
it's hard to do.
To take responsibility.
Because our knee-jerk reaction when being blamed on something is to get defensive.
Okay. We don't have much time. Let's go through the other ones that we've got.
The other way that
situations.
another way that people deal with situations of conflict is to say, well, it's your problem. It's not my problem. You solve it. I'm not involved in this. You know, and that kind of leaves the other person in the lurch. Like, what do I do with that? A third way are the avoiders.
Oh, I hate that.
What problem?
I do
There's
that.
No problem
I
here.
do that a lot.
Yeah, I don't have any problem. And this is just a totally, and suppressing or ignoring a problem situation is one of the worst things you can do, because it's going to come back. It's going to come back at you. When you push it down, it's going to go real deep, and then 1 hour, 1 week, 1 year, 1 decade later, it's going to come out in a worse way.
Definitely. Yeah, I can.
Another way people deal with conflict situations is what I call a yes but. Yeah, it's a problem, but I don't want to deal with it now, or let her deal with it, or I'm going off to Hawaii for a week and maybe it'll all be gone by then. You know, somehow diminishing the problem and pushing it away.
And that's frustrating too, because if there's a problem, it should be dealt with. And it makes the other person more frustrated.
Right. The only real way to deal with a conflict is to confront it with the other person directly. That's the only thing that works, really.
What about someone who always has to win an argument?
Oh, God.
They just have to dominate you, and you just can't seem to win.
Well, you let them win. You let them win by being real clear to them right up front that you know that that's important to them, and that it's like using judo, you know. Somebody who is really lunging at you and pushing you, wants to push you out of the way, you let them do that. You move out of the way, you let them push, or you push on a part of you. You use their own power against them, in effect. You allow them to have the feeling and the belief that they're winning. And then they can relax, because once their need to win is satisfied, then they can start to deal with the situation.
Yeah.
Because they can't really, if you're talking about a person like that, they can't look at it rationally until they felt they've won.
Yeah. What about someone who you obviously don't get along with, but you have to work with them?
Yeah, it's a big business issue.
Yeah.
Well, is there any more specific thing you had in mind as to...
If you work with them in a job situation on a one-on-one basis, and
I think it's one of the things that's important, especially in a business situation, is always to be respectful.
definitely.
And that doesn't necessarily mean just using all the rules of etiquette and being in arms, because that can be done in a very hurtful way too. But to really give them their space, to make them feel okay, and also to let them know that you don't necessarily agree with everything that they're doing, and it's okay that you don't agree. Now, of course, if somebody's impinging on your space, you know, is doing something that is directly or indirectly harmful to you, that's another story.
Yeah. I wish we had more time to talk about this. Thank you so much for being with us today. In wrapping this up then, is to be a good communicator, you have to listen to the person and give appropriate feedback.